Good afternoon and welcome to the Bureau of Business webinar for May 2018. It'll be on the topic of Lincoln Business Indicators. My name is Eric Thompson. I'm the Director of the Bureau of Business Research, and we're bringing the webinar to you today. It's based on some research that the Bureau does with the Lincoln Partnership for Economic Development, tracking progress in Lincoln's economy. Before I get started with my PowerPoint presentation, I do want to mention a few things. First of all, a few features of this webinar. We have a chat window which you can access by hovering over your bar, which should be on the bottom part of your screen. In the same place, you can also access a question and answer window. So you, at any time during the webinar, you can type in your answer. Or type in your question, and we'll be answering the webinar questions at the end after the PowerPoint presentation. You can also wait till the end and ask a question then. The last feature I'll mention is we're going to have two polling questions during the webinar to get the audience's thoughts on certain issues and topics that we'll be covering in the webinar today, and we'll get to those answers then a little later in the webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. This Bureau of Business Research is developed with the Lincoln Partnership for Economic Development. In particular, we develop quarterly and an annual business indicators report for the Lincoln Partnership. And what we're going to talk about in this webinar is the findings of our last quarterly business indicators report. And then we're also going to tell you about select findings from our recently completed annual business indicators report. That full report is going to be released next week at the Economic Development Breakfast of the Lincoln Partnership for Economic Development. So let me go ahead and proceed here and start talking about some of the key findings from our last quarterly business indicators report, which was completed earlier this year, but covered data from the fourth quarter of 2017. What we found in that quarterly business indicators was that the U.S. economy, which for quite some time has been lagging the Lincoln economy, the U.S. economy appears to be catching up to the ongoing robust Lincoln area economy. Stronger job growth nationally, falling unemployment rates nationally, and the Lincoln economy has been benefiting from relative economic strength in recent years. That's continued, but the good news is the rest of the country seems to be catching up. Obviously, that's good news. A lot of us have relatives and friends all over the country. Good to see the economy is doing well elsewhere. And then ultimately, obviously, it's good for the Lincoln economy and the Nebraska economy if the economy is strong elsewhere in the United States as well. That said, I do note that, and we did note in the quarterly business indicators report, that Lincoln maintains a much lower unemployment rate than the United States. These were seasonally unadjusted rates that we reported on in our quarterly business indicators report. 3.9% in October and November in the nation, and right around 2% here in Lincoln. And we know that in April of this year, the U.S. unemployment rate on a seasonally adjusted basis was also at 3.9%. So I think it's fair to say that the U.S. unemployment rate has fallen now and is only about 2% higher than Lincoln's unemployment rate, with the U.S. being at 4%, Lincoln being at 2%. Now, what I would say about this is I think this data indicates that both the U.S. and Lincoln economy are at full employment. It's just that the natural unemployment rate, the full unemployment rate, is significantly lower in Lincoln than it is nationally. We have a lot more college graduates in our workforce. Folks in Lincoln have much higher labor force participation rates. Lincolnites just tend to have lower unemployment rates in general than around the nation. So I think the good news is we have a lower natural unemployment rate than the nation, and you should not interpret our 2% rate to suggest that labor is harder to find in Lincoln than it is around the country. I would say both the country and Lincoln are at their natural unemployment rates. Okay, time for our first poll question. What was Lincoln's strongest industry during the last year, 2017? We're going to measure this with employment growth. So in a way, we're asking, of these three industries, which had the fastest unemployment growth between 2016 and 2017 here in Lincoln? So go ahead and give us your response. We'll show the answer to this question a little bit later in the webinar. Several other key findings from the fourth quarter quarterly business indicators report. Another is that we found that residential building permits are actually lower despite the low unemployment rate and some of the progress I've talked about in Lincoln's economy. The residential building permits issued during the fourth quarter of 2017 were actually a little lower than 2016. We'll present some data on that in a minute. But taxable sales were higher in Lincoln in the fourth quarter of 2017 compared to 2016. So let's look at the building permit data for all of 2017 and all of 2016. You can see there were periods during 2017 where Lincoln's residential building permits were up compared to 2016 at the beginning of the year, briefly in the middle of the year, but by the fourth quarter, the last 3 months, 2017 rates were lower than 2016 rates. Now, I don't think that's all bad. I think what it suggests is the very strong building permit demand for rentals and apartments in 2016 has fallen off a little bit in 2017. We still have decent building permit activity this year, but we might be seeing the beginning of the mix of building permits changing in Lincoln, where we start to go a little bit more towards single-family home building permits and a little bit away from apartment permits. Taxable sales is another interesting development. You can see throughout the year, the blue line, 2017, was quite close to the green line, 2016 monthly taxable sales. But towards the end of the year, we didn't have, you see that taxable sales were a little bit higher in 2017 and 2016. So that suggests growth in retail activity and so forth here in the Lincoln area between the fourth quarter of 2016 and the fourth quarter of 2017. Well, let's look at the first the results pertinent to the first poll question. We were looking at what's the fastest growing industry. We had three choices to choose from: construction, manufacturing, insurance. What were the growth rates in the various Lincoln industries between 2016 and 2017? Well, the growing industries, or the fastest growing industries in terms of employment, were construction, professional, scientific, and technical services, and other financial services, which is primarily banking. So you can see the answer to the poll question was construction, growing almost 6% in terms of employment growth between calendar year 2016 and calendar year 2017 here in Lincoln. So construction was strong, and a majority of you had selected construction rather than manufacturing and insurance. So good job with your answers there. Professional, scientific, and technical services was also growing quite rapidly in terms of employment. That's a very important development. This sector includes a lot of high-wage employment. Information technology is by and large in professional, scientific, and technical services. Architects and engineers, consultants, lawyers, accountants, a whole variety of college-educated and post-college educated workers are captured in the professional, scientific, and technical services industry. So when that industry grows, you're talking about a lot of higher wage employment growth. And I'll show you some data later that also shows that this is really a rapidly growing industry around the country. So if Lincoln can really expand its employment in this sector and continue to do it as it did in 2017, I think that could be a very positive development for our city's economy. Banking, as represented by other financial services, was also a growing industry. Now, there were some industries that lost jobs or were stable between 2016 and 17. Retail trade did lose some employment during the year. That's a sector where Lincoln has gained employment over the last decade, but perhaps giving up a little of that back in 2017. And that, of course, could partly be related to the growth in online sales and so forth here in Lincoln. But perhaps a bit of a surprising result when you think about all the stores that are being built and have opened up in Lincoln in the recent year. Manufacturing did lose a bit of employment in 2017 compared to 2016. And that, to some extent, is part of an ongoing trend in the manufacturing industry where because of high and growing productivity, employment doesn't necessarily grow, even if the industry is growing overall. Lastly, healthcare, and I think this was a very interesting result. Healthcare as a whole did not add any jobs in the Lincoln Metropolitan Area between 2016 and 2017. That's an unusual development. Usually this is a sector that adds quite a few new jobs, up to 1,000 new jobs on a yearly basis. So I think this result suggests some changes that are going on in the healthcare industry. A lot of private sector employers are requiring their workers to have insurance with higher co-pays, with higher deductibles. That's putting more pressure on healthcare providers as their customers start being a lot more fickle about their healthcare spending. So it'd be interesting to see if that development continues in future years. Okay, now I want to go ahead and focus more on some selected results from our annual business indicators report, which looks at the Lincoln economy over the last decade. Before I do that, I do want to ask our second poll question. What were the long-run trends in taxable sales in Lincoln over the last decade? You saw they were up between 2016 and 17, but now we're talking about a decade. 2007, before the Great Recession, or just as the Great Recession was coming on, to 2017. Did taxable sales grow faster in Lincoln than the U.S., at a similar rate in Lincoln and the U.S., or slower in Lincoln than the United States? Okay, think about your answer. Go ahead and answer, and we'll have that information for you a little bit later in the webinar. But first, a few key results from our annual business indicators report. First of all, I think one thing you really notice if you look at Lincoln's economy over the last decade is that Lincoln benefits from a diverse economy, a lot of potential sources of job growth, of economic growth, a lot of good ongoing economic development activities. That's helping our economy as well. But it must be said also that just underlying population growth is a big positive for economic expansion here in Lincoln. It's definitely one of the things that underpins economic expansion here in Lincoln. I think we do get a lot of population growth because of the job opportunities in Lincoln, but it's also true that other factors that cause our population to grow are probably encouraging job growth in Lincoln as well. It's working in both directions. You really see it in the population numbers. So over the last decade, 2007 to 2017, Lincoln's population grew 14% over a 10-year period compared to just 8% nationally. So our population's growing significantly faster than the nation's, almost twice as fast. Here's a chart that provides that same information. You see Lincoln's 14% population growth over that decade, the U.S. around 8%. Interestingly, Nebraska as a whole is also around 8%. So I know we worry a lot about Nebraska, about brain drain and so forth, and losing population. But actually, over the last decade, the state as a whole has added population at roughly the same rate as the nation. So we haven't been falling behind during this 10-year period, at least not very much. Although, as this figure suggests, a lot of the population growth that is occurring is happening in urban Nebraska. I think we'd see a similar bar if we had Omaha on there, that Omaha is growing quite fast as well. Okay, so Lincoln, how is it doing? How is Lincoln having this 14% population growth? Well, I think the key to our success is Lincoln has positive trends in all three components of population growth. So often population growth is broken into three components: natural population growth, births minus deaths, domestic migration, state-to-state migration, or city-to-city migration. You know, how many people are moving from Lincoln to other cities, relative to how many people are moving from other cities and towns into Lincoln. And then lastly, international migration. How many international migrants are settling in your metropolitan area? Lincoln is a young city and therefore has pretty strong natural population growth. Even if there's no one moving in or moving out, Lincoln would add a lot of people because there's a lot of children, a lot of births, and the number of births each year significantly exceeds the number of deaths. So that's underpinning our growth right there. Secondly, despite Nebraska's tendency to lose people on net to other states, the city of Lincoln, or the Lincoln Metropolitan Area, actually has a small but several hundred positive gain of population when you think about migration between other places in the U.S. We do pretty well in terms of people moving into Lincoln from out of state versus Lincolnites moving out of state. But where we really do well is that Lincoln tends to attract people from the smaller towns and cities in Nebraska. So Lincoln, in terms of just domestic migration within the United States, gains more people than it loses. Lastly, Lincoln attracts a lot of international immigrants. Maybe that's partly due to the university. It's also partly due to our robust economy. Immigrants who are focused on work tend to be especially sensitive in their location choices of moving to where the job opportunities are. Now, why does Lincoln attract people? I think there's at least 3 reasons for that in terms of our domestic migration. Obviously, Lincoln has many colleges and universities. Sometimes people come here for schooling, they end up staying. A lot of people from around Nebraska have moved to Lincoln over the last 30 years. Often we see that when younger people move here, their parents might move here too decades later when their parents retire. They want to be near their grandchildren. There's good health care services here in Lincoln, so I think we get some of that senior migration into Lincoln as well. And then obviously the job opportunities available in Lincoln. So I think that positive population growth is here to stay. Sure, it benefits from economic development and job growth in Lincoln, but it has an independent aspect to it as well that underpins our city's economic growth. So here's our, not every detail of our population forecast, but the bottom line is we think population growth will be between 1 and 1.3% per year over the next decade in the Lincoln Metropolitan Area. And just like we saw that nice bar here for 2007 to 2017, we think we'll see a similar looking bar, perhaps a little shorter, but a similar looking bar from 2017 to 2027 down the road. That is sort of one area of real strength for the Lincoln economy. We have some areas of weakness or areas where there's a bit of room for improvement. I'll just mention 2 of those briefly as well. Taxable sales. So I'm kind of hinting, I guess, at the result of the first poll question. And producer services, those professional, scientific, and technical services. We had great trends between 2016 and 2017 last year, but what were the trends over the last decade? Let's look at some of these results. And as we look at the taxable sales trends, it'll also answer our second poll question. We can see that poll respondents were fairly evenly divided, with a third expecting that taxable sales grew faster in Lincoln than the U.S., a little more than a third saying they were similar, and I guess closer to a fifth saying they were slower in Lincoln than the U.S. That last group, I believe, is correct. Here you see the cumulative growth in, it's a big complicated term, non-motor vehicle taxable sales. It means all the taxable sales except vehicles, because that the vehicle revenue is purposed, sales tax revenue is purposed for Department of Roads rather than general revenue. So that's why it's kept separately. Anyway, looking at non-motor vehicle taxable sales, you can see Lincoln only grew about 13% over the decade, actually a little less than population growth, and less than the rate of inflation, which was around 18% cumulatively during this period. So that stands in contrast to Nebraska and the U.S., which were both up around 25 to 30%. So Lincoln had much slower growth in taxable sales. And that is the answer to our poll question. And one kind of mystery about the Lincoln economy. We've had good job growth over the decade. We've had good population growth. We've had some expansion of retail activity. but it hasn't translated into rapidly growing taxable sales. Here's our results for producer services. You remember we had done so well between 2016 and 17, but if you look at the whole decade, we're up only 8.43% in these high-paying jobs that employ a lot of college and post-college graduates. That's a good rate of growth. That's similar to our overall rate of employment growth over the decade in the Lincoln Metropolitan Area. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but it does lag the U.S. So one of the areas of strengths in the U.S. economy over the last decade has been the rapid job growth in these high-wage professional, scientific, and technical services. We've only had about half as much growth here in Lincoln. So if we can change that in the next decade, if we can match or exceed the U.S. in the terms of the growth in these high-wage jobs, I think it would be a huge benefit for Lincoln's economy in the next decade. Well, those were the high points that I wanted to make, or key points I wanted to make, select points from our annual business indicators report. This will be coming out next Thursday. And at this point, I'd like to answer any questions that have come up. Thank you again for joining our webinar here this afternoon. And we'll have an announcement about our next webinar here in a moment. So what questions have we had so far? Is it possible to receive and obtain a print of the screens and slides for this presentation? Yes, it is. We will make those available to the webinar participants. Why would taxable sales be lagging in Lincoln when the rest of the economy is doing well? Well, one possible explanation is changes in the construction industry. So one source of taxable sales is construction materials. As you may recall, Lincoln had a booming residential construction sector, especially a lot of single-family homes in the middle of the last decade. That industry is doing well again, but I'd say it's more of a moderate growth now, sustainable long-run growth compared to the boom that we saw last decade. And so that might be growing a little bit more slowly. Another reason is income growth. Lincoln is a young city, a large young population, a growing young population, and on average, younger people are at a time in their lives where they're still building their annual income, they're still raising their wages, and so there might be limited, slower growth in taxable sales and personal income if your population is getting younger. Okay, another question. Any theories as to why taxable sales growth was so much less than in the U.S.? Again, I'll refer to the answer I just gave to the previous question. I don't think it's a matter of Lincoln's retail sector or entertainment sector not growing. I think all of us who've lived here over the last decade know that it's growing at a nice clip with a lot more options and opportunities over the last decade. I think it's related to the income growth that we've experienced as our population and employment have expanded. What effect do you see the startup and tech ecosystem having over the next few years? Well, I think that startup and tech ecosystem is an awfully large and important part of that professional, scientific, and technical services industry that I talked about a few times during the webinar. A big part of the growth of that, I think, the last year has been growth of our information technology sector here in Lincoln. So if a startup, and especially tech companies, if the ecosystem continues to expand as it has the last few years, if other parts of business, professional, scientific, and technical services, as architecture and engineering firms, legal firms, consulting firms, if they continue to expand, then I think that'll be very positive both for economic growth in Lincoln, but also raising those incomes, raising that taxable sales as well in the coming year. Why is manufacturing growth lagging in Lincoln when it seems to be growing in Nebraska? I think Lincoln is participating in the growth of the Nebraska manufacturing sector. Some of the growth in that sector statewide in recent years has been related to food processing, with the expansion of food processing plants around the country. Perhaps there's been less of that in Nebraska's cities, Lincoln and Omaha, and therefore we haven't quite seen the growth, or maybe there's been a bit of a lag between the Lincoln and Omaha manufacturing sectors and the statewide manufacturing sector. But you have to remember with those employment numbers, because of productivity growth in manufacturing, employment may decline even in a year when the manufacturing industry itself is expanding. And so that's something to keep in mind when you look at employment trends in manufacturing. But a good group of questions. Are there any others? There do not appear to be at this time. Feel free to follow up with the Bureau if you have any other questions. I'll mention our next webinar coming up here on the 8th of June, which is also a Friday. It'll be our Nebraska Economic Forecast, which the Bureau produces with the other members of the Nebraska Business Forecast Council. So look forward to presenting that on June 8th at noon. And please join us if your schedule allows on that date as well. And of course, that'll be a 3-year forecast of employment, income, by industry, taxable sales for Nebraska by detailed industry. And here's how you can follow us on social media. We do release monthly and other periodic reports about the Nebraska economy, and you can see those results here. Oh, one more question. Are the employment data from the quarterly census of employment and wages? Those employment data which we showed for all periods were from the CES, but they were revised data after quarterly census of employment and wages data are used to revise the CES data. So in that sense, they reflect the quarterly census of employment and wages, but no, it's the CES data series from the U.S. and Nebraska Department of Labor. Thank you again.